So here's a couple things that come to mind. I'm gonna interweave some of these notes that I've taken as y'all are talking into this. First of all, here's something I'm really encouraged by. Hearing y'all's discussion here, here's something that I guess I was hoping to see as an outcome, and I kind of feel like I am seeing to a pretty good extent as an outcome, is this. When something, like think about the use of sources and literature in our regular, what I'm calling our regular lives, right? Away from doing a seminary book review or research paper. But if you're just reading for interest, or if you're reading because you're going to be preaching from the Old Testament, and you saw this book about polemics in the Old Testament, relate that to other things. Relate it to if you wanted to read a book on ancient Near Eastern history. If you wanted to go out and read like Enuma Elish and the Gilgamesh Epic and Atrahasis and some of the other Akkadian and Egyptian literature out there, just kind of out of interest. And you could apply this to New Testament studies as well. If for some reason you decided you wanted to read some Second Temple rabbinical Jewish literature because you think that's going to help you understand the New Testament better, or because you think it's going to help you understand Paul better or something like that, or reading some Roman history or Greek history from that period, we go into those kinds of things actually kind of hopeful and expectant, wow, this is going to shed new light on the meaning of Scripture for us. And it's going to help us understand it so much better. And what's a little bit deceptive about this is if you go and you get like the Oxford history of the Near East, you treat that with some skepticism. You go, I'm not sure that that's going to be a reliable history. I've got a book on my shelf at home called The Penguin History of the World. And I read it in college, and then now I've gone back and I reference it every now and then. And it's huge, and it covered like history from microorganisms swimming around in pools of water or goo or whatever, all the way up until probably the early 2000s. I think it brings you up to like maybe 9/11 and post 9/11 or somewhere in there. Can't remember exactly where it stops, but covers a ton of history. And pretty much like the first 4 chapters, you just chunk out because you go, this isn't helpful at all. And then there's some questionable chapters in there, like the chapter on the spread of Christianity argues that Jesus was the second most important person in the Christian movement, and that Paul was the first. That Paul is really responsible for Christianity, but Jesus was an important figure in that movement as well. You go to read something like this, and if you read it uncritically, if you're not used to thinking about stuff from a methodological point of view, and if you don't understand the kinds of ways that critics use Scripture and the ways that they use literature, it would be really easy to just read Currid's book and swallow it whole, and all of a sudden, now your whole view of the Old Testament is shaped by, what is this a polemic against? What is that a polemic against? And you know, and this is something that you see, and sadly you see it in preachers. Some preachers, if they're big-time historians, if they love history, every sermon becomes like a mini history lesson. So every sermon, stop me if you've heard this before. They read the text that they're going to preach, and they go, now, this happened in the late Bronze Age. And in the late Bronze Age, the Akkadian Empire, blah, blah, blah. And it becomes like 20 minutes of, history lesson. And then they kind of draw the Scripture into it. Well, a guy that becomes overly enamored with ancient Near Eastern culture or worldview, or somebody who views all of Scripture as a polemic, that does become the imposed lens on Scripture through which they're now saying, you have to understand the document that they're referring to, then you have to be able to analyze it, and you've got to be able to cross-reference it against the document of Scripture, and at that point you can then explain what was happening in Scripture because you understand how it was being utilized polemically. And I mean, wouldn't you guys think, and feel free to just tell me, no, I don't agree with you on this, but don't most of you guys think that somebody who is untrained, let me just put it that way, somebody who's never thought about method, never thought about critical issues, if they go to Crossway's website and they buy a copy of Currid, are they not going to get it? And that's going to have an influence on them that they think now this has shed a ton of new light, undiscovered information that they just can't wait to share with their congregation. They can't wait to teach and preach on it. Does that sound like a fair? Yeah, that's right, because it's a reputable source, it's an evangelical source, and so they think if they've published it, it must be vetted out and reliable. But because we're looking at this through the lens of methodology, y'all are using terms like consistency, inconsistency, presupposition, conclusions. Y'all are even talking about and applying some literary categories to this, like when Austin's talking about dependence. When you read things through that light, here's the conclusion, at least for me, that it leads me to, is it drives me back to just having a solid hermeneutic that is focused on the Scriptures, on what they say, on the authorial intent of the Scriptures, and being careful not to go far beyond what the Scriptures themselves tell us. Now, I don't want you to hear that I'm advocating like we don't use any additional information. Like we read this passage of Scripture and intentionally try to be ignorant of the history and the worldview and culture around it. I mean, you really can't read the Scriptures that way. There are all kinds of references about in this year of a certain king. You need to be able to put that on a timeline. There are place references, and you need to be able to put those on a map. And weird things happen in Scripture. Weird cultural interactions. You know, you think of Boaz and Poloni Almoni at the gate and the exchanging of a sandal there. Well, you probably need to know what's going on with the exchanging of the sandal, right? So I'm not arguing for cultural ignorance, but I am arguing for the sufficiency of Scripture, that these things are not necessary for us to know in order to understand Scripture. I don't believe that Currid would come to that same conclusion. If he's totally consistent, and by the way, this is not negative toward Currid. I'm very, I don't want to say I'm a Currid fan. You know, it's not like I have a Currid t-shirt or something, but I like a lot of his work. Almost all of his work I've ever read I like. But I do have a critique on this point. I think it's fair to say by the end of his book, he's basically saying if you don't understand this ancient Near Eastern literature and how it's used as a polemic, you can't really understand the story of the Pentateuch or, you know, other places that he references in the end of the book. So I've got some questions. The first question is kind of a leading question, but I think y'all will get the answer to this right. But you might find it a little bit controversial. Just take for a minute the broad category of ancient Near Eastern literature. And some of the stuff that Currid references in particular are the Enuma Elish, the Epic of Gilgamesh. He alludes a lot to the Bell cycles, right, from Ugarit. He alludes to different Egyptian texts, the Book of the Dead, the Pyramid texts, the story of Senua, some of the coffin literature. He refers to Atrahasis. Trying to decide which of these questions to ask first. I'm going to ask the one I wanted to ask first. Who knows more about ancient Near Eastern literature? Us or the people of the ancient Near East?
Probably us.
All right, Adam says probably us. And Adam, why would you think that that's the case?
We have information. There's a much higher access to information than just, I'm not saying that everyone was illiterate.
Mm-hmm.
The not intelligence, the education of the average person, the access to that stuff is much wider than it was in that day. You maybe had 5% of people, maybe, who would have been familiar with these different texts, maybe even in Egypt.
Yeah.
I mean, how many, like, just for example, how many of us know the Constitution well?
Yeah. Great point. Great point.
We have these Egyptian stories that may or may not have been well known that we're expecting the Israelites to know.
Yeah. Great point. Anybody else want to chip in on that to vote with Adam or against Adam? Corey.
Yeah, I would say that we actually have more information on ancient Near Eastern literature. I mean, you just think about the collection of knowledge that we put together, not just of one particular time period, but of many decades and centuries of the ancient Near East that we can look through Whereas, but even if someone at that time period knew some of the legends of the surrounding cultures and countries around them, they probably wouldn't know
Yeah.
that wide of a time frame of information that we have access to today.
Yeah. Well, I agree with y'all's assessment of it. When I look at this kind of literature, I think Adam makes a great point. Now, I know we live in a different culture, but if you just picture some guy, 21st century, America, and he's out, threshing barley in the field, or he's out building a pyramid or making bricks or making straw, or it's, some mother chasing the kids around in the home. You go to the average, whatever like the median American is. I'm kind of terrified to know what that would be. But you go to the median American, and which I realize isn't, for you math guys, is not the same thing as the average, right? But I'm talking the guy in the very middle. You go to him and you say, can you tell me a little bit about how the founding fathers felt about the tax code from the UK and the British Empire? And they would just look at you, right? And you go, well, I realize that that's just kind of ancient history, but we have a lot of great literature in our culture. Like, what do you think about Mark Twain's writings? And how do you think that his upbringing influenced, like, in what ways do you think U.S. Grant's biography would have been written differently if not encumbered by the presuppositions and worldview of Mark Twain? And that guy's going to go, I have no idea what you're talking about. And whatever information the average person has today about the literature of their own culture, how much information do you think the average Israelite, or the average Egyptian for that matter, or the average Babylonian had about the literature that was out there? Now, this kind of does lead me to a second question. To whom was the Pentateuch written? And this is related to a point I want to make in just a minute, but who was Moses writing to? Do we all agree he was writing to the Israelites? So I don't have to play devil's advocate on this one. All right, so he's writing to the Israelites. And as he's writing to the Israelites, he seems to be presupposing that they know an awful lot. Like they have a humongous knowledge of the literature of the ancient Near East. Now I'm going to hit y'all with some questions here. Moses is writing the Pentateuch in the 15th century, right? Are we all agreed on that? Do we have any 13th century guys here? None. I'm still surprised by that you don't have one guy that's like, look, I'm very conservative, I'm very evangelical, but I just hold to a late date for these reasons. All right. 15th century, Moses is writing. The vast majority of the events in Exodus onward are taking place in the 15th century, right? And a third of the events in Genesis are. And then the timeline before that is a little more stretched out, right? From Abraham up to the 15th century, that's going to cover probably 500 years or so. And then who knows from Genesis 11 onward, right? A definite timeline. But as we're looking at that, we're going, the vast majority of the Pentateuch is written in the 15th century to people who lived in the 15th century, right? And then is preserved and endures. The Enuma Elish is Babylonian, right? Does anybody have an idea of roughly when we would date the writing, the composition of Enuma Elish? Could be the 17th century, and most scholars would even date it a century earlier, into the 18th century that Enuma Elish was written. And its provenance is Babylonian, probably southern Babylonian, according to language, other just different factors. But southern Babylon, 18th century, roughly. To stay on the theme of Babylonian literature, the Epic of Gilgamesh. How old is the Epic of Gilgamesh as far as its composition goes?
Like the one they found actually was like from the 7th century BC, but
yep.
It goes from before that.
So the earliest known unified composition dates to about the 12th century. Now, some of the oldest collections that we have are from the 7th century that are mostly complete, but there's a lot of thought in scholarly circles that it goes all the way to the previous millennia. That is probably 20th, 21st century BC. So it is really old. So you go to the 20th, 21st century BC for the Epic of Gilgamesh. You come along 300 years later, you've got Enuma Elish. Now the Baal texts cover a lot of time period, but they're later. 12th, 13th, 14th, maybe the 15th century. But now we're kind of going to the other side of the Pentateuch, right? And we're not that there wasn't Baal worship prior to that, not that there wasn't some legend and that kind of stuff, but most of what we have as far as the written record is about the 14th century BC. The Egyptian mythologies would be some of the oldest. For instance, the pyramid texts could be from 2500 BC. So, I mean, some of the oldest literature in the world are the pyramid and the coffin texts coming out of Egypt. The Book of the Dead is probably contemporary to Moses. So somewhere mid-15th century or so, maybe in the 16th century if you take a really early dating for it. It's funny how, by the way, just as a side note, critical scholars always move in the direction of later for biblical texts and earlier for non-biblical texts. I feel like it gives them some kind of internal justification for their method or something like that, but they always want to look earlier and earlier for non-biblical texts and later for biblical texts. The Atrahasis, another Mesopotamian epic, is probably about contemporary with Epic of Gilgamesh, right? Maybe a little bit later, like 19th, 18th century. Here's the point that I'm making with all of that. Is it really feasible that your average Israelite had a knowledge of even a little bit of this literature? Written anywhere from Ugarit all the way down to Egypt, all the way on the other side of the Arabian Peninsula into Mesopotamia, written over a span, some of this which is later than the Pentateuch itself, or much of it which is later than the Pentateuch itself. What is the realistic probability that they had access to all of this information? And let's set aside that question for just a minute to say, okay, even if they had access to the legends, right, not to the written literature, but just to the oral stories being passed down, can you picture Moses? I know this didn't happen, but just sanctified imagination with me for 1 minute here. Moses goes to a guy and he shares with him, his story of how as a child he was put in a basket, he was saved out of the river, he fled across the Arabian Peninsula to Midian, was brought back to be a deliverer of his people and all of that. And that Israelite stops him and goes, wait a minute, that's the story of Senua. And he goes, you used the same term in your story about you here as is used in the Egyptian literature about Senua over here. And when I think about it, there are chiasms in the same place of your story. And to what extent, because that's what Currid is asking of us, look at all this literary evidence, look at all these carefully arranged arguments. That might be comprehensible to us, but would it have been comprehensible at all to the average Israelite? And would it have been comprehensible enough for him to somehow mentally discern the whole Pentateuch and see it as a polemic against Babylonian gods, but also Akkadian gods, but also Canaanite gods, but also the Egyptian pantheon? Would they have been able to sort all of that out? And frankly, I just don't think that would have been the case. That's one of the reservations that I have about Currid, is it asks an awful lot. It asks an awful lot of the Israelite readers. An alternative to that is maybe if you're looking at a broader audience. So would this have been written to the Egyptians or to the Canaanites? But that doesn't seem to be who's being addressed with the writing of this. Doubtless the message is true for them, but that doesn't seem to be who Moses is writing to. I bet he would not have written it in Hebrew had he intended it primarily for the Egyptians, or had he intended it primarily for the Canaanites, and so on. I have questions about the use of polemic. If you can't sort out those kinds of details, is polemic even a useful way to address them, or to address issues? Is it an effective way to make a point? I'll leave this to you and then open it up for any last questions or thoughts on Currid, but this bothers me because it's a methodological issue. I know I use that word a lot. But what is the criteria for a polemic? Like, how do we know for sure when we see a polemic? I don't have the answer to that. That's not why I'm asking it. I'm asking it to say Currid does not provide me enough information to be able to validate. And Travis, you hit on this. He doesn't give me enough information to validate, is this indeed a polemic or not a polemic? So those are my thoughts. I think some of it's useful. I think some of it's interesting, but that's about all. And I'm going to say that it doesn't influence my preaching of the text to any great extent. Yeah, Christian.
Framing the thought of just saying his basic thesis that there is two extremes, right? He said that there are two extremes. One that kind of separated that the Bible does not have to do with Near Eastern. But in the other extreme is everything is a copy from the Near Eastern.
Mm.
But he says, I think the truth is something in between.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the point that I'm making is that is a slippery slope to say, oh, God could inspire those stories.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and you use then secular story baptized with the inspiration of God.
Yeah. Yeah.
I see that terribly dangerous.
Yep. I think it's dangerous, and I think that it begs yet another question. I feel like I have more questions than I have answers for y'all tonight. It begs another question, and that is it legitimate to use a polemic to make a different point than the polemic itself makes? So these different stories, Atrahasis, Epic of Gilgamesh, the coffin text, those stories are making a point, right? There's some kind of instruction that's being intended by it. So is it legitimate then to pick up that story, basically retell it with your own characters and place, and then make a different point than those stories were originally making? So I guess that kind of overlaps with, is the criteria consistent? Yes, sir.
I think I'm more sympathetic toward the Egyptian polemic.
Great point.
The Israelites.
Yes. Yep.
They would have more interaction with the culture. I don't know about the literature, just because, I mean,
Yeah.
literacy is questionable throughout this.
Sure, yeah.
But I mean, they would actually know some of the gods there, some of the popular myths that were going on.
Absolutely,
Even
yeah.
Some of the surrounding cultures, a little bit.
Yeah.
I mean, we know about like chupacabra or something like that.
Right.
I don't know much about it.
The question is, do you believe?
Yeah.
Are you a believer?
That's a good question. So like, I'm more sympathetic towards some of that. But I mean, I think the literature is just, that's questionable. If it wants to be able to say,
Yeah.
pull that from.
This is good. I think y'all got some fantastic thoughts on this. I'm going to throw one thing up on the whiteboard real quick, Shannon, while you're talking. And I know you guys online are not going to be able to see it well, but it's not, trust me, it's not going to be that great. I just feel like I want to make a point here that maybe visually will help.
Well, I couldn't quite hear what he said just before me, but it sounded like he may be thinking along the same lines as me. Were there enough commonly held beliefs and understandings in the culture at that time? Like, I think back to one of his first examples of a polemic was the throwing down of the staff and turning into the snake. And there was, the belief of the power of the serpent was a deity power working through Pharaoh. Was there enough of an understanding in the court and in the culture at that time that something like that would have held real significance, even if some of the deep understanding of the literature may not have?
Shannon, I think you're making a great point, and I'm gonna tag onto your point with what I'm about to say. And I know y'all can't see this on the board at all, and my apologies for that. Hey, when you guys graduate, create an alumni association that makes big donations for stuff like cameras that can capture the board up here and real cutting edge stuff. I don't even know if y'all can see that. It's so light. You can barely see it. That's because Dr. Johnson has murdered our markers.
This drawing is a polemic for the vote.
I seriously cannot find a marker that's working. This would be roughly a map of the Near East, which I know y'all all recognized as soon as I threw it up on the board, right? And if we divided this up into Egypt, and then if we divided, Canaan up here, and then everything in this border and onward being, Babylonian, the Sea of Galilee, the Jordan River, the Dead Sea, plains of Moab, being over here, that kind of thing, if you're just thinking of it like that. You have distinct units within the geography of the ancient Near East. You've got Egypt over here. You've got Ugarit. You've got Canaanite literature, which we're usually referring to Central Canaan when we talk about that. You've got, the Sinai Peninsula would be more located down here. But on the other side of the peninsula there, then all of this onward becomes Babylonian literature, right? So this is all in Akkadian from here on, whether it's in the northern, like Assyrian provinces, or it's in the southern Mesopotamian provinces. This is basically Akkadian. I think that it's legitimate, and Shannon, this is to your point, that if we take these bodies of literature and we say there's an Egyptian, there's a Canaanite, there's a Babylonian, but include Akkadian with that, okay, Babylon and Akkad and all being written in the same kind of literature. And let's just call it Canaanite Ugaritic because of the geographical proximity. If we had to say on a scale of 1 to 10, how much utility and how much familiarity there is with these cultures just on the Pentateuch, just focusing on the Pentateuch. How much knowledge of Babylonian literature and culture do y'all feel there is by an Israelite born and raised in Egypt, including Moses being born and raised in Egypt? Like, is 3? All right, how much do you guys know about Native American theology? And you live on the continent. Bunch of oppressors. No offense, a bunch of imperialists. Y'all live on their continent and y'all don't know about their theology. How much do y'all know about South American or Central American legends and myths?
I can Google it.
You can Google it, but Moses didn't have Google. Some say he had an early version of ChatGPT, but so maybe, their knowledge of that kind of literature is a 2 out of 10. And I think that's extremely generous. I bet you would be hard pressed to go to the average Israelite and say, name me one one Babylonian myth. And he would totally strike out. He couldn't even name a god from Babylon, probably. Canaanite and Ugaritic material is probably maybe more like a 5 or 6. For one, the Israelites had spent some time in Canaan prior to their history in Egypt, but that was hundreds of years ago. They lived in some proximity to them, and they shared some common roots, even though technically Abraham is Mesopotamian, right? So anywhere on the scale from 4 to 6. But how much would they have known about Egyptian theology and worldview and culture? They wouldn't be masters of it, just like we're not masters of our own literature and worldview and culture. But on this relative scale, maybe they're an 8 or 9. So what I'm arguing for here is this doesn't have to be an all or nothing proposition. And for that reason, Shannon, I think Currid makes great points about the interactions between Moses and Aaron and Pharaoh. I think that those things would have been known and understood, especially by Pharaoh, the characters in the story, the magicians and stuff like that. It would have been understood by the people broader in the story, like the Egyptians when they saw the Nile River being turned into blood. I think there's, on a scale of, is Currid right about that? Yeah, I think he really is. I think he's talking about things that the Israelites would have seen and the Egyptians would have seen and gone, that's a judgment against our gods. The God of Israel is doing what our gods cannot, or he's now rendering them unable to do what they could do previously. But to what extent Atrahasis and the Epic of Gilgamesh are being pulled into the discussions in the Pentateuch, for instance, I'm really just very leery about that. So I think there's a scale of polemic, or at least the results of polemic. I don't think it's just a universal, and Currid seems to put it at level 10 all the way across the Pentateuch. Like it's all out there for them to know. And I think it's more realistically on kind of a scale. Okay, well, I think we've almost hit 10 minutes on this discussion like I wanted to. Any concluding or other, David? Yes, sir. Oh, David, did you have your hand up? Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, it seems like you put more emphasis on the human author and the divine author most of the time, how they were so ingenious and working this out and crafting it, and it's just saying, well, God organized history in a way that refutes these other deities, and Moses was recording what God had actually done.
Yeah, very good. All right, well, I've enjoyed this. This has been a good discussion. I hope y'all enjoyed Currid's book and it didn't just feel like drudgery having to write it or read it and think about it, because I do think it's helpful for a lot of this stuff. Let's transition to the book of Numbers. Bamidbar is the title for the book of Numbers. Where do we derive that title from? The first verse. And the first verse tells us that the events of the book of Numbers are happening where? The Lord spoke to Moses, Bamidbar. He spoke to him in the wilderness. It's interesting that the whole book is framed, at least from a canonical standpoint, with that statement. Hebrew books derive their titles from a few different places, occasionally from the most prominent character in the book, occasionally just from simply the first word of the book. So like Bereshit is the title for Genesis because it's the first word in the Hebrew text. Here, Bamidbar is a thematic name of the book. It's telling us that this is occurring in the wilderness, a place where Israel shouldn't have been to begin with. The book of Numbers, had Israel been faithful and obedient, would have been unnecessary, and yet in God's providence it was made necessary and it was carried out. A couple of questions. I know that because we just covered all these questions about Currid and all of that, y'all may be questioned out a little bit, but let me solicit two questions from you guys. First of all, in your reading of Numbers, what have you found to be the point or purpose of Numbers within the Pentateuch? What purpose have y'all found that it serves in your reading of Numbers, but also in the other literature that we're reading on it? Any thoughts there? Well, it has a function in the Pentateuch, I'm presuming, right? It's there for a reason. We haven't been talking a lot about this as we go. We understand, I think, Genesis to me is the hardest of the books to say it has a singular identifiable purpose because it accomplishes several aims, it seems like, concurrently. Genesis is a record of the beginning of creation. I don't think that's really its purpose. Genesis, I don't think, was written for the purpose of teaching us about creation. I think creation is a part of the larger story. It introduces us to the problem and the reality of sin and estrangement from God, introduces us to his covenant with his people, his intentions to reconcile his people to himself. And so, we had the sort of preaching of the gospel there even early in the book of Genesis. And the book of Genesis has a focus from broad to narrow, right? Think about how many years Genesis 1 through 11 covers. Anybody want to take a stab at it? By the way, I don't know that there's a hard and fast answer here, but anybody have a thought maybe of how many years are covered in that Genesis 1 through 11?
Round number right at 2,000, somewhere between 1,700 and 2,000.
All right, so both saying 1,700, 2,000. Any contrarian opinions here? I think it's possible it's significantly more than that. I don't think the biblical genealogies are butt-ended to each other, and so I don't think that they end at one and start at the next always. I think there are gaps. I think you can demonstrate that even from later literature in the Old Testament. So I don't think that the genealogical record gives us a total definite amount of date. We probably would end up at something like 1,700, 2,000 years if we did that. There are also gaps in it that are just unknown to us. For instance, how long were Adam and Eve in the garden prior to the fall? Is there any evidence anywhere in Scripture to teach us about that? I don't feel like there is. So they could have been in the garden for one day, If you wanted to get real theological about it, you could say something like, that's the longest that man could possibly go without sinning, but Adam and Eve didn't have the same fundamental nature and its corruption that we have. So they could have been in the garden for eons. But at minimum, 1,700, 2,000 years, right, that are taking place in the early chapters of Genesis. The timelines, oh, sorry, yes.
Does Genesis not give us Adam's age? When he dies, like in one of those genealogies?
It does. Does Adam's age start from his conception? Does it start from the fall? Was Adam dying? Was Adam growing older prior to the fall? That would be the question that comes up in that discussion. So there's this chronological shortening, right? Because starting from Noah and his sons, now you start covering things like a generation at a time. There's also a geographical narrowing, where we're looking at things in the scope of the whole world, the creation of the cosmos, and then the flooding of the entire earth within that cosmos, and things begin to really narrow down, beginning with Abraham in Genesis 12, to Abraham following him around through Canaan into Egypt, back to Canaan, then Joseph to Egypt, and there's a narrowing that seems to be focusing on one particular thing, and that is God had promised Adam and Eve in the garden that he was going to give them a deliverer, that through their offspring, singular, right, as Paul clarifies later on, through their offspring, their enemy is going to be defeated. And this narrowing that starts at Adam, which functionally is the whole of the human race, right, comes down to a particular descendant of Adam, down to Noah, down to a particular son of Noah, down to Abraham, and then particular sons within Abraham's genealogy. And it's all preparing us for and narrowing us toward God's work to save his people through his Redeemer, right? Through the offspring of Adam and Eve that's going to save them. The purpose of the book of Exodus then becomes the story of how God is going to execute their deliverance and their judgment. This is why the New Testament so frequently looks back to the event of Exodus with that particular feature of it in mind. God's faithfulness to his people and his deliverance of them out of calamity. The book of Leviticus, as I don't know if we touched on this particular point last week, but if I had to summarize Leviticus' purpose, I think it would be fair to say that it's to instruct Israel in what it means functionally to live in the presence of a holy God. And so, what does that require of them ceremonially, culturally, worldview-wise, theologically, other categories? What does it mean to live amidst a holy God? Does that just mean he's indifferent toward them and he's going to fight for them no matter what they do? Does it mean they have blanket amnesty for whatever they want to say and do and think, and God is going to fight for them? Or is God going to require something of them? And it becomes, if you're going to answer that question and say, well, I suppose God is going to require something of us, couldn't he have just made it like one chapter? God is just going to require a couple things from us, but there's this whole body of holiness, right, that he demands. And Leviticus explains that process of God making himself known to his people, what he requires of them, and so on. We understand that Deuteronomy is a exposition of the law, right? Not just simply a restatement of it, but Deuteronomy is an exposition of it. A new generation of Israelites now need the law preached to them. They need to be instructed in it. My question that I started with is, what is the function of numbers within that? Now, don't worry, if y'all don't have any answers, we're going to talk about it in a minute. But I do think it's the book within the Pentateuch. Let me just say two things about it. Number one, I think it's the one that has the most indefinite purpose. So it's the hardest of all of them, I think, to pin down what exactly the purpose of the book is. And secondly, I think it's just the most, I want to say this like in a really respectful way, not hodgepodge, because that's a very not respectful way to say this, but it just seems like in many places it's a collection of miscellanea. A story here, a law here, an explanation here, another story here, maybe a prophecy here, and it's just sort of brought in to explain this process of wandering in the wilderness in maybe a way that reflects the chaotic nature of that wilderness wandering anyway. That to read the book of Numbers is in some sense like to be an Israelite that's wandering around in the wilderness. My second question was, do you have any helpful thoughts or ways to think about the structure of numbers. So think about its purpose or its structure. Yes, sir.
I think of themes of like complaint
Mm.
and rebellion. But I kind of also think like this is in a way a bookend of one generation of Israelites and the starting of another generation.
Okay.
I could go back and forth.
I think both those things are legitimate. If you're looking for thematic unity and coherence, it's there. A lot of it is arranged around themes. Some of it is arranged similarly to Judges in that it's sort of cyclical. Okay, yeah, good thoughts there. Any other helps for us relative to structure in Numbers? Well, if you think of something along the way here, feel free to interject and jump in. Let's cover a little bit of ground and we'll take a short break. Relative to structure, there's a couple things that I'm giving these to you not to say here's the definite structure of Numbers, but just some things that help think about it, especially if you're sitting down with Numbers and you're going to preach through it someday, which you all are, and you're going to be thinking about this book big picture. Like this is a year before you're going to be preaching on it. You're trying to see the whole structure of it. These are some things that might help. To the point that we were just talking about, it's a transition between generations, right? So the first generation in chapters 1 through 25 and the second generation of Israelites post-Exodus are brought together here, and there's a transition that's taking place. A group, and these are big transitions, by the way. The first generation had seen the miracles in Egypt. The second generation had not. The first generation had experienced oppression in Egypt that the second generation had not. The first generation had seen or had heard directly from Moses. They had seen the pillar of cloud and fire that they followed around right after Kadesh Barnea. They had seen these things. They had seen the construction of the tabernacle. They had been given the original law. When I say they, I know that we're talking about a huge number of people here, but a good number of them had actually seen with their own eyes the smoke descend on Mount Sinai. They had seen the altar that Aaron had built. They saw the destruction of that. I mean, they had seen incredible things. But the next generation hadn't seen those things with their own eyes. Doubtless, they're closer to them than we are, but maybe not that much closer to it than you and I think that they are. They had heard these stories, but they hadn't actually seen them and experienced them. Olson refers to this as the end of the old generation and the birth of the new. And I do think it's helpful when you're reading the book of Numbers at least to have an awareness that that generation in the first 25 chapters, they've seen and experienced the things that we've read about in Exodus and Leviticus, but this next generation has not. And so they need to be taught what had happened there the same way that you and I need to be taught what had happened there. That's why Deuteronomy, it's so important not only to be a retelling of the law, but to be an exposition of it. You and I need exposition of the law. We need to understand what it means, not just have a record of what it says. John Sailhammer is a very helpful, albeit critical voice in the book of, in all of the Pentateuch, frankly, but in Numbers in particular. He writes that within the larger time frame, the primary dividing point of the book of Numbers is 1445. Now, let's look at that real quick. Think about it as a possible, because keep in mind, this is still well within that narrative of the first generation of Israelites, right? So he's looking to this. Remember, this comes on the heels, by the way, in Numbers 14 of Moses pleading for God to spare the people, for lack of a better way of saying this. I mean, that's really what happens. God is going to wipe out the generation. Why? Because of the complaints, right? A term that we just talked about. The Israelites are like a perpetual letter to the city council. Just like, our water system stinks, our schools are no good, the road, why can't we widen the roads? We need more business. Okay, I guess maybe I don't have that much familiarity with city council stuff, but you do. Oh, you're an auditor, so you see this. You see the complaints. Like somebody writing to them that my dog got sick after walking down your streets. I need to know what kind of chemicals are being used to wash the pavement. Right. Fire department, they all stink. The police department, on the one hand, is never anywhere doing anything, but on the other hand, they're just stopping people left and right for petty reasons. And you go, wait a minute, those things don't seem all that consistent. In Numbers 14, the destruction and defeat of disobedient Israel in the hill country of the Amalekites is what he sees as the transition. So actually, let's go back to verse 39 and start there. So Moses told the words to all the people of Israel, and the people mourned greatly. And remember, the words that Moses was sharing with them was that God was, try to paraphrase a lot of what's said there, he's not going to bear with them any longer. Their complaints have been incessant. He's going to pour out his judgment against them. And so the people mourned, and they rose early in the morning and went up to the heights of the hill country, saying, here we are, we will go up to the place the Lord has promised, for we have sinned. But Moses said, why now are you transgressing the command of the Lord when that will not succeed? Because the Lord has now told them, don't go, right? And they've decided, well, then we're going to go. And so Moses is asking them, well, what do you suppose is going to happen? Like, you've sinned against the Lord. He's promised judgment against you. Now you're going to try to avert. You know, sin makes you act foolishly. Sin makes you do things that are almost unbelievable. And when you read this story, you go, this doesn't even make sense that they would do it. But they're going to take matters into their own hands. And so Moses warns them, do not go up, for the Lord is not among you. That's an important statement in this passage here. The Lord is not among you, lest you be struck down before your enemies. This implies that they're only ever going to have success if the Lord is among them, right? And if the Lord isn't with them, their military prowess, you know, I hear people talk about, and some people try to do this to confirm the, I don't know, not really even the reliability of Scripture, but when you, for instance, some of what you read in 1st and 2nd Kings and in Judges, preachers always try to make the point that, you know, this battle tactic was so cunning, they still teach it in West Point today. And that's not really the point of any of Israel's successes, that they were just brilliant tacticians. It's that the Lord was with them. And anywhere that they went, even including a place like Jericho, if the Lord gave it into their hand, they would be successful. But they could go to Ai, and they could be defeated by a little nothing town, right? I graduated from Southside B Branch High School. How many of you guys have heard of Southside B Branch High School? 1, 2, 3. My graduating class was 27 people. And I loved it. My friends there were people from country boys like me. I mean, you had a class of us that was like Wranglers, boots. We carried spittoons to class. That was us. And you had a class of people that were dark, like Gothic. I don't know how exactly you would describe it, but all black, you know, shirts and pants that were so wide at the bottom they covered their shoes. You never knew if they wore shoes or not. And then you had people that were just kind of preppy, and you had people that were very wealthy and well off. A lot of oil money was flowing through there, and natural gas money at that time. And you had people there that were very poor, and guess what? We were all friends. We all hung out, all enjoyed one another's company. Loved it. Loved being in a little bitty school like that. B Branch, Arkansas is a little nothing town. But the point is, you can go to a little town that's a blip in the map on your way or after Jericho. If the Lord's not with you, you won't be successful. It's a really important statement here that Moses is saying the Lord is not with you. So it's pointless to go into battle. The Amalekites and the Canaanites are facing you, and you will fall by the sword because you have turned back from following the Lord. The Lord will not be with you. But they presumed to go up to the heights of the hill country, although neither the ark or the covenant of the Lord nor Moses departed out of the camp. It's one of those cases where Moses just sat back. And, you know, he has a tendency in these narratives to go with his people, right? Moses is very patient. He's very long-suffering. He's just pled with the Lord, don't kill him. But maybe even here, Moses recognizes it's total futility. It's total futility. And so they go up, and the Amalekites and Canaanites who lived in the hill country came down and defeated them and pursued them even to Hormah. This is, I think, an important transition in the book of Numbers. because it could be viewed as the point where the Lord has finally, totally, and it could be the evidence of what was given in the first part of chapter 14, right? So the Lord had promised judgment. Now here's the proof of it. And this generation is totally hopeless now and will never see success or prosperity henceforth. Another way to think about the structure of it is to think about it in terms of its geography. So when we first come to the book of Numbers, we're still at Mount Sinai, right? And I know that there's some debate about where we would locate Sinai, if we would put it in, what did this town, the name of it just left me. So we're putting it in the southern part of the Sinai Peninsula. Somebody help me with the name of the town located in the southernmost point there. Okay, I'll think of it in a minute. Anyway, we can put it there in the Sinai Peninsula. We could put it in the Arabian Peninsula, depending on, some people will take the interpretation of how Israel crossed across there. But they're at Sinai. And I think looking at the map, at least one point of plausibility for it being in the Sinai Peninsula is it's basically a straight northeastern shot from there to Kadesh Barnea. Now they travel upward from Sinai to Kadesh Barnea, not all the way in the south of the peninsula, but kind of centrally located. Sharm el Sheikh, by the way, is the name of the resort town down there. They come up and they come to Kadesh Barnea, and what happens there? I know, like when you get put on the spot with questions, something under normal circumstances you would blurt out the answer to, you might be hesitant about. Okay, so that's where they encamped to send the spies into the land. Kadesh Barnea is a very important place in Israelite history. And they come to Kadesh Barnea, and there's an act of disobedience there. Now, this results in them wandering around in the wilderness, but in the latter chapters of the book, beginning in chapter 22, they end up in the plains of Moab. Now, where is Moab on your map? Okay, it's east. So they've come down. I'm not even going to mess with my beautiful map up there. I want to leave it for Dr. Johnson's class. They come all the way down south of the Dead Sea onto the eastern part of the Jordan River into the region there that's known as Moab, which is a totally nonsensical way to get to Canaan from Kadesh Barnea. But that's kind of the whole point of what happens in their rebellion there. So one way to think about it is in terms of geographical progression, not just for geography's sake, but because distinctly different things are happening at each of these locations. There's a giving of the law. There's an attitude of faithfulness at Sinai. There's a lack of faithfulness and rebellion that occurs in chapter 13 at Kadesh Barnea. And then there's a general confusion, hardening of heart, complaining, resistance to Moses, resistance to Aaron, resistance to Yahweh that's happening in those later chapters. And then Moab becomes the scene of preparing the next generation. In some ways, Moab can be thought of as a second Sinai, that now the law is going to be given again, the covenant's going to be re-ratified in Moab, and the people are going to launch out from Moab to Canaan the way they were intended to launch out from Sinai to Canaan. And Moab becomes something of a second Sinai, without some of the theatrics, okay? Without some of the cloud descending on it. And obviously there's a difference in being on a mountain and at a plain. Childs observes the problem of determining the structure from the geographical indicators is seen most clearly in chapter 21, verse 9. From a literary perspective, a major division at this point is far from obvious. This disagreement confirms the impression that there are no clear indications within the text of how they wish to divide the material at this juncture. And so the biblical editors, now we know what that term means, right? The biblical editors seem less concerned with this literary problem than our modern commentators. I agree with Childs that some of the questions we're asking as modern commentators and some of the things that are being communicated by the author, singular, of Numbers are different. However, I disagree with him strongly that this is just a result of basically hodgepodging the book of Numbers together. But he resists this, and it's important to know it's not universally accepted. There's also some chronological progression. There are chronological markers within the text the book opens with on the first day of the second month in the second year after they had come out from the land of Egypt. So Israel has been some time at Mount Sinai, right? And they've come out of the land of Egypt. In chapter 10, during the second year, the second month, so we've moved basically a year forward, right? Because we went from the first year, the second month, to the second year, the second month, on the 20th day of the month. And then they take off from there to Kadesh, and then we can begin to reconstruct the 40 years that they're wandering around from there to the occupation of Canaan. So those things are meant to just be some helps to thinking about the structure of it. Let's see. We've got 45. Do y'all want to take a 5-minute break? All right, let's take 5 minutes. We'll come back and then we'll cover this pretty quickly here and see if we can't cover most of the rest of this handout. So come back in 5 minutes. All right, talking about function, a little bit of the book of Numbers. This first quote to you is one that you've already read. As a matter of fact, these first couple quotes you've already read from Briggs and Lohr. Their argument about the function is to try to find a bridge between Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, and then later Deuteronomy. They write that the book of Numbers can be seen as the glue that joins the two major poles of the Pentateuch, the priestly literature and Deuteronomy. So that's P and D, right? That's what they're saying? All right, do y'all agree with that? I mean, I thought I might as well just ask the question. Once again, I'm kind of bothered that there's not one contrarian voice in this entire class. Like, I wish one of you guys would assume that role. Dan Graves, you look perfectly suited for this role tonight with the toboggan. You look like you could be the contrarian voice.
It's cold here. That's why I'm in New York.
All right. Well,
You cannot be the contrarian voice. I really haven't thought about it that deeply, unfortunately.
okay. Well, we don't want to impose the contrarian voice on you. But I just feel like we could use one guy to go, yeah, that kind of makes sense based on, and then we could just all pile on him at one time.
All in favor of Dan, say aye.
Yeah, right. We're going to take a vote on Robert's Rules of Order applied to theological arguments. They go on to say the attempts to discern an independent structure of the book were misguided because it was never meant to function independently of the other books in the Pentateuch. In other words, the narrative of Numbers moves the reader of the Pentateuch from Leviticus to Deuteronomy, from one place of instruction to another. Now, there may be some, well, to what extent do y'all agree or disagree? Y'all are going to have to get used to just blurting out, I disagree with that, I agree with it. If I hear an answer I find interesting, I'll ask you to elaborate. Do you agree with them?
No.
No? All right. One voice speaks for the many. You know, one of the things that, as I'm looking at this, I think of as a question is it does call the question, to what extent did these books circulate independently? To what extent did they function independently? I do think we need to at least concede the point and have in mind that the Pentateuch didn't really circulate as independent books. It circulated as a composition. So a Sefer Torah would have been the way that it was passed down from basically everything that happened after the 10 Commandments were written on a tablet. It would have circulated together. You just don't find a lot of remnants out there of Genesis just out on its own or Exodus out on its own. It does seem that the Pentateuch all traveled together. Now, that should bolster our argument for the unity of it, the singular authorship of it, the antiquity of all of its parts, that it all moved together. We can actually draw some positive points from that. Now, where I would say I agree and I disagree with their conclusion here is I agree with them that these books weren't intended to function independently. They weren't on their own. Talking about the books of the Pentateuch. This isn't true of all the biblical books. For instance, the book of Psalms doesn't seem particularly dependent on any other collection within the Old Testament. It's a coherent thing. But I would say this, that it doesn't render the book of Numbers incomprehensible on its own. I think you can preach and teach from the book of Numbers immediately after preaching and teaching on the book of John, and it's still totally comprehensible and understandable in its own right. There's another point that's made here, and this comes from Bud, his commentary on Numbers, where he draws out the idea of the book of Numbers, the theme of it being inheritance of the land as a goal that is still to be realized. He mentions that the importance of the OT, as with other ancient literature, we always run into those kinds of qualifying statements, lies in its capacity to reflect at a deep level the persistent problems and aspirations of communities across centuries and cultures, and so to speak effectively to them. So what he's saying is you've got to write your literature in a way that your readers are going to be able to relate to. We talked about this, I think, in like the first lecture of the class, which I know y'all all remember all the stuff that we talked about in the first lecture, right? Yeah. Thank you, Adam. I appreciate it. I mean, you just lied right to me, but I appreciate the confident, affirming way in which you did it. You said, yes, we remember everything from that lecture. Maybe you're not lying. Maybe you do remember everything from that lecture. He's saying you've got to write to them in a way that they're going to resonate with, so that they'll see themselves in the story, so that they'll identify with its ethos. The question becomes, okay, if he makes that claim, in what ways does he see Numbers contributing to that goal? In which ways does it actually accomplish that? His answer is coming as one of a series of, after the book of Exodus, the book of Numbers deals with what is, in a sense, a liberated community. As we have sought to show the possession of the land is the goal of the journey. So if we just take this one step at a time, I feel like I agree with that. I mean, part of it, though, is the deliverance itself. That's part of the goal. But without getting overly semantic, certainly Yahweh is leading them to the possession of Canaan, right? Mm-hmm. That was the promise made to Abraham. That's the goal that's being advanced. Much attention is given, particularly in the latter part of the book. So think probably chapter, well, in the case of Sailhammer, 22 onward, maybe 25 onward. I'm not sure exactly what Bud would refer to here as the latter part of the book. Much attention is given to certain principles which must control the life of the community and the land. Now, it seems to me like Leviticus was arguing for that same thing. I mean, if the Kadesh Barnea incident didn't happen, wouldn't Leviticus have given them sufficient information for how to live in the land? How to construct the tabernacle, how to furnish it, how the priests were to function, how the sacrifices were to be done, how justice was to be administered in the land. I just feel like all of that was already there in Leviticus. I understand it's got to be given to another generation, but that information was there. So I don't find their answer there totally satisfactory. They go on to say the relation of possessing the land to enduring spiritual truth or lessons is this, that the whole enterprise of possessing the land, and I'm condensing down a lot of what he gives there as specifics about dispossessing the people that are there, tearing down their altars, pushing out their religion, just everything that they were to do calls for action, faith, and courage. Obedience, he says, is not an abstract value, but a commitment to the enterprise with a view to securing the land in a way that gives religious freedom and economic and political security. Okay, to what extent do you agree, disagree with this, or feel like you want to cogitate on it, Frank? As you've noticed, I'm using that word in every setting that I can now. I think it's a plausible explanation of the purpose of Numbers. It's one that does seem to capture all of the disparate parts, bring them together, give them kind of a singular trajectory, because it elevates the reality that the goal of the Exodus has not been accomplished yet. Like the goal of the Exodus was not the giving of the law at Sinai. I'm not saying that the law of Sinai was not intended to be given, but that's not the reason that God was bringing them out of Egypt. What happened at Kadesh Barnea obviously is not. Following the pillar of cloud and smoke is not. Being in the plains of Moab, going to war with the Moabites, that was not the goal of the Exodus. It was to go to Canaan to possess the land that the Lord had sworn to them. That's what's linking Genesis 15 to the book of Exodus, to the book of Leviticus, to the book of Numbers, is that promise. So what's happening in the book of Numbers, at least is kind of an overarching thing. My bad, Christian. I left this behind. I got it now. Christian's so disappointed in my lack of decorum with the mic this semester. I guess it was laying right there. Hopefully they could hear me. The point does seem to be possessing the land that they haven't possessed yet, the fulfillment of that promise. Now, on the route there's some theological and historical developments that take place. So there's some advancing of the narrative of the canon, right? I quote here, again, a quote that you've already read. I didn't require this book last time I taught this class, but I still thought if you've read this, it's helpful for us to talk about it together. In Genesis through Leviticus, there's hardly any mention of the Levites. True statement? I think so. I mean, not a whole lot is said about them. In Deuteronomy, however, the Levites appear frequently as a marginalized group, deserving the charity of Israelite landowners. I'm not sure about the marginalized group piece of that, but they are wholly dependent on the administration, the right administration of Israel's cultic practices. So how is the reader to make sense of the different perspectives? They're asking the question, why is it shifting from such little mention in Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, to Numbers that they begin to, or in Deuteronomy, they begin to play such a prominent role? Well, the book of Numbers offers a solution by distinguishing priests from Levites. The priests belong to the tribe of Levi, but the Levites are a minor clerical order, as in within that family, with responsibility for aiding the priests in carrying the tabernacle. What they're arguing for here, and this next quote might make this clear a little bit, is they're arguing that there's more narrowing that's happening. That we're going from Israel, then we begin to focus on the priestly establishment within Israel. Now we're looking at a minor subset of that priestly order in the Levites. The distinction between the priests and Levites, they say, is significant. Closely associated with the appointment of the Levites are the instructions in chapter 6 for setting apart ordinary Israelites as Nazarites. And the inclusion of this material in the early chapters of Numbers reveals that the taking of a special holy status was freely available to all Israelites. There's a whole lot that Alexander is saying in that quote. Almost too much for us to parse tonight, given the time that we have remaining. But take away from this sub-point just this one thing, that there is theological trajectory here. There is historical trajectory. Things are moving in the narrative. We're not left by the time we come to Deuteronomy where we were at the end of Leviticus at Mount Sinai. The theme of holiness, I believe, is picked up and is developed from Leviticus. So as y'all been reading things, you'll learn that JEDP actually doesn't encompass all the sources out there, but there's actually a holiness source as well. It's really cool. It's like a new source is born every day. Every day a star burns out, every day a new star is born, and every day a new source emerges in historical criticism. And at some point along the line, the holiness source emerged on the scene of Leviticus. Rarely, though, do critical scholars address how the theme of holiness is developed outside of the book of Leviticus, as if it's self-contained in that one document. But I think that theme doesn't need to be left behind in Leviticus, so that when we come to Numbers, we've totally forgotten it. This quote from Childs, and I quote a few things from Childs here. Childs argues that in spite of the diversity of its subject matter and the complex literary development of the book of Numbers, it maintains a unified sacerdotal interpretation of God's will for his people, which is set forth in sharp contrast between the holy and profane. Any problems with this quote before I continue on? I feel like we all agree with that. One of the reasons that in my top at least three, I'm not going to say favorite, but in my top three guys that I like to read and interact with on Old Testament issues is Reverend Childs, is because rarely do you find somebody that you can so wholesale disagree with one page of his book and then turn to the next page and so agree with it and go, wow, this seems really helpful and really useful. And I think Childs makes an important point here. And remember, in your category, in your lexicon of disciplines of criticism now, what kind of criticism is Childs most known for? What's that? Canonical criticism, right? So he has a lens already to say, where's the continuity between Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy? He's looking for points of contact, points of unity. It's important to be able to read authors with an awareness of what they're going to be looking for and what they're going to be trying to find in the text. We know that Childs is looking for coherence. He's looking for unity. And he finds it here by saying this theme of holiness and God demanding holiness is not confined to Leviticus. It's being brought over into Numbers as well. To give some definition to the terms he uses, when he talks about holiness, he's saying that this is Yahweh's presence, the blessings that come from it, the cleanliness laws that make them holy, Levitical service because it's set apart, right? And before the Levitical services can be carried out, they have to be cleansed. Aaron's atonement, inheritance of a clean land. That's why they're going into the land, right? Is to ritually purify it. Those are the kinds of things he's seeing as holy. The kinds of things he's seeing as profane are uncleanliness. So this could be from a host of things, right? Touching a corpse, a woman who's menstruating, somebody who has violated an explicit law, has transgressed their neighbor in some way. These things result in wrath, judgment, death, forfeited inheritance, pollution of the land. Now, drawing a distinction from Leviticus, so in other words, not seeing Numbers as just Leviticus part 2, Childs says this: the book of Leviticus also focuses on the issue of the holy and the profane, but the theme of the march and conquest were first introduced in the book of Numbers. So what I would say you can take away from that quote is he's saying Numbers now looks forward. It's almost as if the Israelites had no idea what are we going to do next at Sinai. They received all these laws, but they don't understand what the next step is. And now in Numbers, they're being pushed up, go to Kadesh Barnea. The intention is to get there, send the spies. The spies come back and say, the Lord has given the land into our hand. They advance northward and they conquer the land. Instead, like they teach at West Point, they decided to make a tactical flanking and come around through the plains of Moab. I mean that tongue in cheek. Victor Hamilton highlights a note on the holiness at the outset of his book, or at the outset of the book. And if any of you guys have Hamilton, I include this reference with the thought that maybe some of you have Hamilton's book. He points out that holiness is explicit within the text. We don't just have to derive it. All right, what kind of time do I have here? About 5 minutes to give you all some buffer. Yeah, we can cover this because we only got not even a full page left to cover. So hunker down, as they say. Another theme that's important is the rebellion of the people and the faithfulness of Yahweh. Just read this with me. Some of the people's complaints, some of their rebellion. In chapter 11, this serves, by the way, as a precursor to at least the idea things are not going to go well at Kadesh Barnea, which is chapter 13. In chapter 11, the people complained in the hearing of the Lord about their misfortunes. And when the Lord heard it, his anger was kindled, and the fire of the Lord burned among them and consumed some outlying parts of the camp. Then the people cried out to Moses, and Moses prayed to the Lord, and the fire died down. And so the name of the place was called Taberah, because the fire of the Lord burned among them. Now the rabble that was among them had a strong craving. Interesting translational choice on the part of the ESV, if I do say so myself. And the people of Israel wept again and said, "Oh, that we had meat to eat." And this next statement is really sinister. That we remember the fish that we ate in Egypt that cost nothing, and the cucumbers, the melons, the leeks, the onions, and the garlic. But now our strength is dried up, and there is nothing at all but this manna to look at. See, this isn't just the people complaining that we're hungry, we're thirsty. It's the people saying, our lives were better under those Egyptian gods. Our lives were better under Pharaoh than they are under Moses. Our lives were better in that land than they are as we're approaching this land that you've promised us. This isn't just the people complaining. I think that's one thing. There's one category of complaint where it's like, man, it's hot out here. That's understandable. But the root of all complaining and discontent is fundamentally saying to ourselves, God is not dealing as good with me as he ought to. Things could probably be better somewhere else. You think about all of the things that I'm not making this a y'all thing, it's an us thing, we all, that we complain about in our lives. Sometimes work is hard, and we complain that work is just running me ragged. We complain about things at the church, that there are fights that are going on, or there's this issue that's happening, or there's things not happening the way that we want them to happen. I mean, those of us at Trinity don't complain about that, but Frank, other churches do, Billy, other churches do. We complain about something with our kids, something in our marriage, something in our life, and what we're doing when we complain is we're not just saying, it's not just a neutral acknowledgement that, okay, this thing's not what I would like it to be. It's a deep-rooted, God, what you've given me is not satisfactory. There's something different out there. There's something better, something more. And here, you know what? The Israelites are just saying out loud what we say internally every time we complain. God, you've put me in this church or this family or this place or this marriage or this work situation, and out there, things would be different and better. Now, I'm not saying it's not right for us to pray for the Lord to change our circumstances. Certainly, we get in circumstances at work and sometimes in church life and different things that we go, you know, Lord, I need help here. I recognize there's an unsettledness, and if it's your will, can you change this circumstance? But we've got to be careful that we don't become the Israelites who say, in Egypt, the cucumbers were pretty good. I've eaten a lot of cucumbers, and frankly, I don't believe I haven't eaten a lot of cucumbers. I've eaten a couple of cucumbers, and I don't eat them anymore. I don't believe them here, because who eats cucumbers and longs for those, right? They're looking at the melons back in Egypt, the fish there, saying, wow, how good were things there? This is a really serious complaint. In the next chapter, in chapter 12, Miriam and Aaron spoke against Moses because of the Cushite woman whom he had married, for he had married a Cushite woman. And they said, has the Lord indeed spoken only through Moses? So what are they asking there? Somebody translate that for your congregation.
Who put you in charge?
Okay, who put you in charge? They're not really asking the question, are they? This is one of those questions that's actually a statement, where they say, Moses doesn't have a monopoly on what the Lord is saying and what the Lord is doing. When they ask, has he not spoken through us also, is that a legitimate question, or is it a statement in the form of a question? Now, they're saying God doesn't just speak through Moses, he speaks through us as well, and the Lord heard it. Notice that there's a connection here. And you Hebrew guys can go and do the syntax work and confirm whether this is true or not. What seems to be happening here is both of these statements are being made, they think, away from the hearing of the Lord. They thought that they were saying this away from the hearing of the Lord in chapter 11. Aaron and Miriam here think that they're saying this away, but in both passages it says what? In reality, the Lord heard. It's connected with a wow conjunction, which the ESV has a propensity to always translate as a coordinate conjunction, but in reality it can be contrastive, it can serve other functions, and it could be, yet the Lord heard, or now the Lord heard. I think it's being used in a different sense than a simple coordinate here. The Lord heard it. Now the man Moses was very meek, more than all the people who were on the face of the earth. Interesting editorial note there from our author, if I do say so myself. But there's a contrast here to where Moses is being spoken against by Miriam and Aaron as God's instrument of deliverance out of Egypt, and as his chosen spokesperson. Then chapter 13, which is famous, and you would have to read the whole chapter. But the beginning of verse 25, at the end of 40 days, the spies come back. So they'd been in the land 40 days. They come back. They came to Moses and Aaron and all the congregation of the people of Israel in the wilderness of Paran at Kadesh. And they brought back word to them and to all the congregation, showed them the fruit of the land, said, we came to the land which you sent us. It flows with milk and honey, and here's the fruit of it. That's great. Everybody picks up their bags. All the soldiers pick up their weapons. They say, it's just like the Lord told us. And then the spies say, well, wait a minute. However, the people who dwell in the land are strong, and the cities are fortified and very large. A fortified city would have been rare, probably at this juncture. And besides, we saw the descendants of Anak there. And the Amalekites dwell in the land of the Negev. The Hittites, the Jebusites, the Amorites dwell in the hill country. The Canaanites dwell by the sea and along the Jordan. What are they saying there? I don't see a way for us to actually conquer the land. It's a good land, but I don't see a way that we're going to take possession of it. This kind of theme continues to surface. For the sake of time, I'll just mention to you, of course, of Korah's rebellion in chapter 16. Actually, I do want to read that reference real quick. So in chapter 16, Korah, the son of Izhar of Kohath, a son of Levi, and Dathan and Abiram were the sons of Eliav, and On, the son of Peleth, sons of Reuben, took men, and they rose up before Moses with a number of the people of Israel, 250 chiefs of the congregation, chosen from the assembly, well-known men, and they assembled themselves together against Moses and against Aaron, and said to them, you have gone too far, for all in the congregation are holy, every one of them, and the Lord is among them. So why then do you exalt yourselves above the assembly of the Lord? So now there's infighting. Miriam and Aaron are fighting Moses. The sons of Korah are fighting Miriam and Aaron and Moses. All of the Israelites are at war with Yahweh, who they believe is taking them out here in the desert to die. It's just chaotic. And there's a lack of faith and trust in the Lord here. Israel complained after they defeated Arad. This quote summarizes it from J.K. Harrison. In light of all that God had done for his people, the book of Numbers is clearly a study in the contrast between God's faithfulness and human disobedience. That seems to me to emerge as a major theme in this book. And since we have 1 minute, let's talk about Balaam and Balak. Let me just ask y'all a question. Y'all read this story. It's quite unusual in chapter 20 through 24. The suggestion by Zanoni is that Israel has a pluralistic view of religion, and that it is not just from Moses, it's not just from Aaron, it's not just through that line that revelation and truth comes. When y'all read that story in Numbers 20 through 24, is that the right conclusion? Is that the point? That God is really the God of all peoples and all religions everywhere? Look at this quote and tell me if you've ever heard something similar. It's not unknown in our times that secular institutions have preached the gospel, while the church, the new Israel, has remained thunderously silent. What do you suppose they mean by that? Or what does he mean by that? Well, what he means is this. Anytime a school, an institution, a government seeks social justice, aren't they preaching the gospel? Anytime that they argue for racial equity, aren't they preaching the gospel? Every time they try to elevate women and break glass ceilings and create an egalitarian society, aren't they preaching the gospel? No evangelical would believe that, would they? I'm not even going to call out the Gospel Coalition or something to try to make a point. But we do have in evangelicalism today an idea that a preaching of the gospel just happens anytime and anywhere we advance some biblical idea. That if our government enacts a law that is derived from biblical law, that's equivalent to preaching the gospel. Or that if our culture advances ideas that are biblical ideas, that it's preaching the gospel. And what it does in the process is it lays waste to even the idea of the gospel being a coherent thing at all. What is the gospel? Is social justice the gospel? Is loving your neighbor the gospel? Is caring for widows the gospel? Is building an egalitarian society the gospel? If there was no poverty, would the gospel have 100% penetration in our society? the advancement of biblical ideas is a good thing, but I don't draw a conclusion from this story as Zanoni does, that the Lord preaches the gospel through all kinds of people. Preaches it through governments, preaches it through secular institutions, and it's the church, that is the evil here that has failed to preach the gospel. This story, I would suggest, potentially brings together a lot of what seems to be the miscellanea of numbers. This quote from Hamilton summarizes it. This actually is a longer quote, and I thought to revise this and include some of the other stuff because it might make it more clear. But he says, almost ad nauseum, Numbers has related and will relate stories in which Israel's existence is threatened. Indisputably true, in my opinion. But why is that? Consistently, the reason for potential demise has been internal. Israel is its own worst enemy. Israel need not fear, says this story, the incantations of an international wizard, where they should begin to do some deep soul searching when a critical spirit, fault finding, and backbiting emerge. The Lord here is using the nations to judge Israel. He's putting his truth in the mouths of a non-Israelite to preach to them and to pronounce their judgment. That's a real terrifying thing when you think the enemy's outside and they're actually within. Christians would do well to remember that our enemy is not outside. We see him every day in the mirror, right? There's the battleground of our great spiritual war. All right. Concluding thoughts, questions about the book of Numbers, or do y'all feel satisfied that now we know everything of the book?
What do you think about those people that say the Balaam story probably was not in Hebrew originally, and so Moses had to? Wow.
Yeah, my answer is I don't ever think about that. Other questions?
Taking the part of the bad guy here, I think chapter 12:3 was just a priestly addition to redeem themselves after Aaron's misbehavior.
Yeah, man, I've never thought about that, but that you make a good point. You make a good point. Frank, I'm going to go back and study that really close. As soon as I can find time on my schedule, I'll go back and really.
Well, I know what your schedule looks like.
I'll go back and focus in on that. Thank you, Frank. Though I appreciate it. I appreciate the levity and the help. All right, you guys online, any other questions? Man, thank you all for joining us tonight. I really enjoy this. I hope it's profitable for you. Go take a break for a little bit because Dr. Johnson will be in 5 or 10 minutes or so. So come back. But thank you all for joining tonight.